Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you the things we got wrong, the things we left out, and all of the Taiwans we Japanned. We'll get to that later. I'm Rob Rath, head writer of Extra History. I absolutely love this series. I'm so excited to talk about this because I'm from Hawaii myself, and I will take literally any excuse to talk about Pacific history because I think it's fascinating and people don't know enough about it. Just FYI, if things look a little bit weird around me and bare, it's because I'm not at home in Hong Kong. We went home to visit family for the summer because the way quarantines are working right now, we probably weren't going to be able to do seeing family again for another year. So we just sort of had to go. We'll be back soon. So next time you'll see all my 40K models and unfortunately, I had all sorts of cool Hawaii stuff that I could put all over my desk. I had bone fish hooks and, shell lay and things like that. But, oh well, all right. No cool wood bowls for you. Let's get started with recommended reading. The first one is On the Road to the Winds, An Archaeological History of the Pacific Islands Before European Contact by Patrick Vinton Kirsch. This is a really cool academic text that tells you the how, whens, and whys how do we know and who was settling where and when? It's also a really great book. It tells you all about the many, many theories that have now been discredited about Pacific settlement, and it sort of humbles you with what you know now. It makes you a little bit worried when you're writing a series for YouTube that's going to be up there forever. Oh no, in 10 years someone could discover a bunch of stuff that renders this entire episode moot. A less academic book that's covers similar ground is Sea People, The Puzzle of Polynesia by Christina Thompson. Both of these books talk about different periods of theories about how people got in the Pacific Islands, all the way from God put them there. There's at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, there's an amazing illustration of this where it's just like a giant hand coming down with little dudes jumping off of it, and I'll remember it forever. But the Spanish and a lot of early European explorers were like, how did people get in the Pacific Islands? God put them there. There's a really good website. The Polynesian Voyaging Society has a very good website, www.hokulea.com, that talks a little bit about wayfinding and Pacific voyaging and celestial navigation. They have a lot of good resources. Let's just jump into episode 1. So a lot of you were asking, why are you pronouncing it Hawaii rather than Hawaii or Hawaii? Because Hawaii is the correct pronunciation. So it's also a more formal pronunciation, right? So if you're hanging out in Hawaii, you'll hear people on the street saying Hawaii rather than Hawaii. In Hawaiian, there are V's or W's that are pronounced as a V. There's also this glottal stop. It's basically the same as the space in uh-oh between the I's. So you pronounce them separately, right? Hawaii. Generally, when you're dealing with Hawaiian history, you say Hawaii rather than Hawaii. It's just a term of respect. I wanted to use it to show that we were paying that respect. And now I probably should have paired that with also saying Aotearoa rather than New Zealand. I didn't want to throw too many pronunciations at Matt in the first couple of episodes. I knew that we were going to use the term in episode 3, so I just kind of was like, we'll just wait until then. So sort of ease him into, Hawaii and Rapa Nui and also we try not to use too many unfamiliar proper nouns in our episodes, just as kind of a strict Bible thing of best practices. We feel like specific terminology and lots of dates sometimes makes people tune out. So we tend to keep things simple. If I did it over again, I would probably say Aotearoa from the beginning and then transition into New Zealand later on. A lot of people were saying, hurricanes in the Pacific, don't you mean typhoons? This is a British American English thing. In American English, they're all hurricanes. So when I'm in Hawaii and I get hit by a hurricane, it's a hurricane. If I'm in Hong Kong and I get hit by a hurricane, it's a typhoon. I actually prefer typhoons because then you can say super typhoon, which is great. Category 5 hurricane, I don't know, it's just missing something. It doesn't have that like punch of super typhoon. I like super typhoon. Many people mentioned that we didn't say that the Austronesians got to Madagascar. Absolutely true. I was focused more on just like getting into the Pacific Islands. I kind of was like, well, I mean, that's on the map, but we're not really talking about that right now. Kind of save it for lies. So Austronesians did make it to Madagascar around 500 AD. They formed the Malagasy ethnic group that has a lot of ethnographic markers of Austronesian societies, which is very cool, including dental modification, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Another thing people mentioned is there are these theories that that Polynesians got to South America. Like, you didn't mention this. So this kind of stuff I think about like really, really hard when I'm writing the episodes. And the reason is that sort of like bleeding edge stuff, that there are some indications, but it's not set yet. There's no smoking gun. Frequently I'll leave them out and talk about them in lies. And the reason is a lot of theories like that end up getting knocked down like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years later. And if you read the books I recommended, The Road to the Winds and Sea People, you'll see tons of those kind of things just like get demolished wholesale. That for 20 years, everyone thinks something's one way, and then it turns out that the evidence was tainted in some way. And a lot of the evidence for South American contact has been very mixed. Like, there's one with DNA in chicken bones, but like there are studies that have found opposite findings. There's the thing of why are there sweet potatoes in the Pacific Islands when they're a South American crop? That is really interesting. And yeah, it's possible that people could have moved them from one place to another, but it's also possible like a bird might have eaten them and pooped them out on an island, or they fell into the water and then just got circulated around in the currents. That's how all the vegetation got out to the Pacific Islands, right? But right after our 3rd episode came out, there was a really neat article in the journal Nature that was a genetic study of Native American populations and Polynesian populations, and it suggests pretty conclusively, according to the people who wrote the study, that there was a single meeting event between Native American populations and Polynesian populations before the settlement of Rapa Nui, so before 1200 BC or 1200 CE. It's really cool. It's much more of like a smoking gun. If that had been out, I would have put that in the series, so that's unfortunate. But I always really caution people with studies like this, even when they're really exciting and seem really airtight, that the way science works and the way academia works, you kind of want to like let those results settle for a couple of years and just let other people in the field kick the tires a little bit before they go like, yeah, that looks good. Like, this looks like it's a thing. So I tend to be very cautious about that kind of thing because YouTube is forever, right? And I don't want this episode to be up like 5 years from now and then like that study gets overturned and, you know, it's still on our episode. So, but it kind of came back to bite me on this one because I totally would have put it in if that had been out. We said Taiwan, and the little star was on Japan. It was only in one frame, thankfully. I should have caught it when I did art review. Sometimes you get in a situation like where you can't see the forest for the trees when you're doing these reviews. You know, there's 200 drawings in every episode of Extra History. And maybe you're just like looking at the Pacific Islands section of it and like the peripheral vision just like doesn't pick it up for whatever reason. I hate it when this stuff happens because there's all this great information in the episode and all this stuff to enjoy, and frequently just people see the mistake. So I'm sorry about that. Been to both Taiwan and Japan. Don't know why I didn't see that. Episode 3, we said 1300 BCE when we should have said CE. At least it's really obviously wrong so that everyone was not misinformed that there were like time traveling DeLorean canoes. I flagged this for fixing, but for whatever reason, it didn't get fixed. COVID is making things kind of difficult. comparison of cultures, there were a few people who said, when we mentioned in the episode, like, I could go on all day, like, comparing a bunch of different societies in the Pacific. They were like, well, we would love if you did that. We would listen. The problem is, if I have go on for 300 words, that's like 2 minutes of extra art time, which is a lot to ask of our artists. So I had about 300 words of that I just cut out of the script. But nobody's animating me right now, so I can just go on for a couple minutes. One thing that's really neat, that's shared in a bunch of the Pacific Islands, it's not in Polynesia, but it's in Micronesia, Melanesia, and maritime Southeast Asia, is dental modification. So tooth blackening with these certain kinds of dyes that actually prevent tooth decay. There's the aesthetic removal of teeth, or the filing down of teeth to points or different shapes. This is like one of these Austronesian cultural markers that is all around, but for whatever reason, it never made it out into Polynesia. The thing that did, of course, was tattooing in these amazing geometric patterns that are very similar to what you see on lapita pottery, which is a really cool thing, like the idea of that dispersal. And, to this day, they inspire artists. And in fact, University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I went to school, that's our sports logo is based on Pacific tattooing traditions. Really neat. We talked about the dwellings built on stilts. I just want to talk about how they worked, because it's so cool to me. One of the reasons, like when they're built close to shore, that you would build on stilts is partially so you could build over the water. But even when you didn't do that, like, it helped with flooding, right? If the water comes up, then your house is still fine. But it can also help with building granaries. They don't have grain in them, obviously. That's like they have rice or taro or whatever, sweet potato. But if you have them off the ground, like, scavengers are not coming into your granary or your house to eat your food. But they would also put caps on these pillars right below the house. So if you've ever seen like a bird feeder with like a squirrel guard on it, that's what this is. So it's so the Polynesian rat can't like scramble up and eat all the food. There is a very similar term for the mythic homeland of all of Polynesia. So in Aotearoa, it's Hawaii. In the Society Islands, it's Avaiki. In Tahiti, it's Hawaii. But it's not present, this like idea of the former homeland is not present in Hawaii or Samoa. But what's cool is that both of them have islands that have a similar name. So Hawaii and Savaii in Samoa. Let's talk about the 6-foot Norwegian in the room. Some of you want to talk about Thor Heyerdahl and the Kon-Tiki expedition. So if you're not familiar, Thor Heyerdahl was this Norwegian adventurer and ethnographer who had a theory that like Peruvians actually settled the Pacific Islands from, I should do it the other way, from the east, from South America, like through like land in Rapa Nui and dispersed that way. Even at the time, the evidence was very much against him on this. The linguistic evidence, the archaeological evidence, like pretty much everything you can imagine. Heyerdahl had a tendency to be very selective with his evidence. And he did have this kind of amazing adventure where he built a balsa wood raft using sort of sketchy descriptions of Incan boats from the Spanish, and went from South America to the Marquesas, which is a cool kind of adventure, and I won't fault it on like on that aspect. But he just was not like very scientific, and was wrong, like very wrong. And frequently he didn't just like clash with academics. Like people in the Pacific really did not like his theories because a lot of them involved like drifting rather than active navigation and seamanship. So there's a lot of pride in the Pacific Islands, like in wayfinding and celestial navigation. And Heyerdahl was not quite with all that. like, but also just like the archaeology and the science of his theories is just like all messed up. And I want to read you the greatest archaeological smackdown I've ever read. And it's from archaeologist Robert C. Suggs, who's an American. He was the major proponent of the dispersal out of Taiwan and through maritime Southeast Asia into the Pacific Islands. And he said this of Heyerdahl's theory of settlement. Heyerdahl's Peruvians must have availed themselves of that classical device of science fiction, the time machine, for they showed up off Easter Island in AD 380, led by a post-AD 750 Incan god hero with an AD 750 Tiwanaku material culture featuring AD 1500 Incan walls and not one thing characteristic of the Tiwanaku period in Peru and Bolivia. This is equivalent to saying that America was discovered in the last days of the Roman Empire by Henry VIII, who brought the Ford Falcon to the benighted Aborigines. Yeah, these two did not like each other. There are still people who stand up for Heyerdahl. A lot of them, weirdly, are kind of like ancient aliens, people who want to connect Peru with Rapa Nui. Yeah, in general, his theories are not accepted at all in mainstream academia. Though this genetic evidence of a meeting between Native Americans and Pacific Islanders is really intriguing. But his thing was not just that they met, but it was like that there was this dispersal, right? So not really. Another myth that used to be widely believed that kind of came up in the comments, I'm just going to do this real quick, is the idea that the residents of Rapa Nui destroyed their ecology in order to build the moai, the statues. This was believed for a while, and there was like a lot written about it in the popular culture and how this was like this great ecological fable. It turns out basically to not be true at all, that likely the changes that were going on Rapa Nui were natural changes and changes in climate, and that actually that the people living there made a lot of changes to their own behavior to be more sustainable and be more resilient to these environmental changes that were happening to them. The belief used to be, the theory used to be that they cut down all their trees to build these statues. They didn't have any trees for canoes, so they couldn't go fishing. So then they ended up over-farming the land because they weren't getting the protein from fishing. This basically all turns out not to be the case. There's no evidence of a decreasing marine diet. And now we've found all these soil enrichment projects that they were doing. So there was this idea of like, okay, the land is bad and it's getting worse, so we're going to make the land more fertile. And maybe we have smaller crops, but we have more productive crops. And why this was missed before is it didn't look like European-style farming. So it is kind of an ecological fable, but it's about trying to do better with what you have. Episode 4, Magellan was actually Portuguese. We didn't mention this specifically in the episode. I swerved around Magellan a bit because I felt like we could do a series just on circumnavigators and circumnavigation. So if that interests you in the future and you're a patron or want to become a patron, that would be a good thing to suggest. Let's talk about Isabel Barreto, the first woman to become an admiral in European history. A lot of you wanted to know more about Isabel. I can't tell you a whole much more, actually. There's a lot more information on her in Spanish than in English. I can pick my way through a newspaper in Spanish, but I absolutely could not do research. But what I can tell you is that her grandfather may or may not have been the Portuguese governor of India. And of course, when we talk about Portuguese India, we're talking about Goa. She was an iron-willed woman who managed to keep discipline on a ship full of rebellious, mutineering adventurers, basically. But a lot of what we know about her comes from her Portuguese navigator, Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz. and the feud that they had after they reached Manila. So they evacuated out of the Solomon Islands. They managed to get through Guam and then to Manila. And essentially, the two of them just engaged in this massive mudslinging competition about like who was at fault for this disaster, who was the one who pulled them out of the fire. Each insisted that they were the one who was responsible for saving people and that the other had not helped the situation. Queros basically said, like, I was actually in charge. She just shut herself in her cabin with all the food and like hoarded all the food and was incredibly cruel to the crew. A lot of the crew did mention that she was cruel. From her perspective, maybe she was saying like, look, we're at sea for a long time. We don't know how long this is going to take. So I'm going to sit on all the stores of food and we're just going to portion out a little bit at a time. Having said that, when you read about like the class system in Spain at this period, like it's also totally, believable that someone who is in a higher position would essentially hoard food and live it up while everyone else is living on spoiled rations. So it's one of those things that's like, don't really know who to believe. Like, depends on how much you put stock in Queros, who is this very prolific writer who wrote a lot of letters to the king. But, he's inherently biased. He doesn't seem to really like taking commands from a woman or the fact that she was left in charge instead of him. So who knows? Episode 5, we said New Zealand was named after an island in Denmark. It is not. It is named after a province in the Netherlands. Don't know how this mistake got made. Find it very frustrating. Like I said, I nobody hates it more when stuff like this happens than me, because I and other members of our team, like our fantastic artists, put like so much time into this episode. I hate it when I throw something in that ends up being wrong, and is obviously wrong, and it doesn't get caught by me during review. Yeah, I'm sorry. Don't know how it happened. Bougainville's expedition also included the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. It was the housekeeper and mistress of his botanist, who dressed up like a man and pretended to be a dock worker and got hired on, and was sort of there to nurse the botanist through the voyage. He was not a very well man, actually ended up dying on the voyage. She's a very interesting person, Jeanne Barret. There's a book about her. I don't want to talk about her too much just in case we do a one-off. But the book, if you're interested, is The Discovery of Jeanne Barret, a story of science, the high seas, and the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. Yeah, it's a really cool story. It can get a little bit dark, though. There are various theories about how her being a woman was revealed to the crew, some of which are very not nice. We called the Cape of Good Hope Cape Horn by accident. When we talked in episode 5 about European discoveries, so we very specifically did finger quotes, right? And the reason I did that, rather than saying the first European to discover or whatever, is because we just had to be really careful on word count. I said before, like, if I go like 150 words over, that's like a minute of time that the artists have to fill. And I figured that with this series, we had talked about the settlement, in basically 3 episodes. So I figured we had a little bit of leeway, that people wouldn't think that we were saying that, Captain Cook was the first one to an island that has people on it. I figured if it was a one-off, I absolutely wouldn't have just said discovered or discoveries or whatever. But I felt in context with the larger series, it would be okay. Sorry if it sat wrong with you. I understand why. Coming up on Extra History, we're going to watch Aurelian and Diocletian pull Rome out of a death spiral with ending the 3rd century crisis. I cannot wait until you see the first episode of this. We do something really weird in it, and I love it. After that, it's time to manipulate Rome from across the Mediterranean with Cleopatra. We didn't mean to do like 2 Rome E-series in a row, but that ended up happening. Next one, it's up to you. The patrons are currently voting on the theme before the war, after the war. We've got options like the War of 1812, the Meiji Restoration and the end of the samurai, the 30 Years' War, and the formation of the Aztec Empire. It was a triple alliance that came out of a succession crisis and civil war, which I didn't know until it was suggested, which is pretty neat. Please support us on Patreon. You can get episodes early. You can suggest and vote on topics. You can be part of our patrons only Discord server where you can ask questions, and I will answer them. We have a lot of cool sponsored episodes coming out soon that I can't talk about, but I can say that we are doing our first ever Extra History Halloween episode. If you've ever seen the Christmas episodes I write for Extra Mythology on Krampus and the Yule Lads, you'll know how absolutely much I love this like weird, creepy stuff. Last of all, Ibn Battuta's side trip. So we're doing this instead of Walpole Fact because we're running out of routes back to Walpole that we haven't done before. And instead of a Walpole connection, we're going to do a Bismarck connection, not to the man, but to the battleship. So if you've watched our Hunting the Bismarck series, you'll know that the Bismarck was escorted by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. It managed to be one of the 2 capital ships to survive the Battle of the Denmark Strait, or survive that entire chase of the Bismarck. The 2 that made it out of the Denmark Strait that ended up going on to fight the rest of the war were the HMS Prince Wales and the Prince Eugen. Prince of Wales ends up sinking in the Pacific. It gets sent to defend British Malaya, is caught up in the December 7th, 8th surprise attacks, and is sunk along with HMS Repulse by Japanese torpedo bombers. And those are the 2 first capital ships that are sunk solely by naval air power, signaling the end of the battleship. But the Prince Eugen has a bit more of a strange route to the Pacific, because it too ended up sinking in the Pacific. It survived the war intact. It was handed over as a war prize to the Royal Navy, who handed it over to the US Navy, who decided that it was going to be part of Operation Crossroads. If you're not familiar with that, basically they towed it out into the Pacific to Bikini Atoll and detonated 2 atomic bombs near it, an airburst and an underwater bomb. It was 1,100 meters away, so it only sustained minor damage. It did spring a small leak and was heavily irradiated by fallout, so they couldn't get aboard to fix this small leak because the entire vessel was radioactive. So the US Navy towed it from Bikini to Kwajalein Atoll, where it foundered and started listing and capsized and sank, and it's still there to this day and still radioactive. In 2018, the Marshall Islands government, along with the US Navy, led a joint operation to actually pump all the oil out of it because there was all this fuel oil still on it that looked like it was about to spill into the ocean in Kwajalein. So yeah, that's where the Prince Eugen, this famous Atlantic battleship, or heavy cruiser, I should say, this heavy cruiser that was very famous for the hunt for the Bismarck, is now just sitting in the Pacific as one of the most famous battleship wrecks there. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you next time. Ahui ho!
Legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 for helping to make this show possible.